Silas Dren had always been known as reliable, a meticulous scribe whose devotion to his duties within the Ordo Hereticus was unquestioned. But beneath the stoic surface, a nagging doubt had quietly simmered, one that, until now, he had been too afraid to confront. The very thought that the Imperium might not be as righteous as he'd been taught to believe had never even crossed his mind. For 23 years, he served the Imperium as an archivist of the fourth rank, cataloging the horrifying acts carried out in the name of the Emperor. His work, though brutal in nature, seemed to serve a greater purpose, a purpose that Silas believed was essential for humanity's survival. The vaults, as cold and sterile as the silence that permeated them, felt like a tomb. Rows upon rows of data scrolls, stacked like the bodies of the forgotten whispered secrets he was never meant to hear. He had always understood the horror of his work, the daily cataloging of brutality, but in the face of the discoveries now laid before him, it was no longer just work. It was an indictment of his soul. Every execution, every cleansing order, every massacre was justified as a necessary evil in the face of an uncaring galaxy. But everything changed when Silas was granted access to the most secure and secretive vaults of the Inquisition, vaults that no archivist had ever entered. These were the deepest archives, containing records and files sealed away from public knowledge, protected by the highest-level inquisitors. Silas had never imagined that anything could be hidden deeper than the atrocities he had already catalogued. But what he found within these vaults shattered everything he had ever believed, leaving him to question not only the legitimacy of the Imperium, but his own identity. His world was unraveling piece by piece, as the grim records before him revealed a brutal reality that defied the ideals he had fought to uphold for so long. The records he uncovered were unlike anything he had seen before. Entire worlds, entire populations erased from existence by the Imperium's highest authorities. These weren't accidents or mistakes, they were deliberate acts of cruelty sanctioned by those in power. Loyal citizens, soldiers, entire planetary populations had been condemned to die, not because they had fallen to heresy or treason, but because they were deemed inconvenient. It wasn't just heretics or Xenos that the Imperium had purged, it was anyone who stood in the way of maintaining the Empire's suffocating control. As Silas pored over these records, he found that the atrocities were not the actions of a failing, desperate empire fighting for survival. These were the actions of an Imperium that had become a machine that maintained its vast reach and control by systematically eliminating those who posed any threat to its structure, whether that threat was real or imagined. The idea that survival required sacrifices had always been ingrained in Silas's mind, but what he discovered in these vaults made him question whether the sacrifices were truly necessary, or if they were simply the result of a deeply ingrained bureaucracy willing to eliminate anything or anyone deemed inconvenient. The implications of what he had found were staggering. Entire populations were exterminated based on factors like political convenience, economic efficiency, and strategic positioning. The Imperium's system of governance, once thought to be motivated by honor and justice, was revealed to be built on something far darker. A cold, calculating pragmatism that valued efficiency and control above human life. The records painted a terrifying picture, a world that had been obliterated for no reason other than that it had become politically inconvenient. A mining colony, its inhabitants wiped out not for the threat they posed, but because their labor was no longer deemed necessary. A planetary governor executed not because of treason, but because his reforms threatened the established power structure. Silas had always believed in the nobility of the Imperium's cause, but now, faced with this evidence, he could no longer reconcile what he had been told with what he was seeing. The scale of the brutality was staggering. Millions of lives wiped out in the blink of an eye, with no justification beyond the need for control. And Silas had been complicit in documenting this horror, believing it was all necessary for the survival of humanity. For years, Silas had catalogued these deaths with a detached professionalism, his mind shielded by the belief that the Imperium's ruthless actions were necessary for the greater good. But now, as the vaults revealed their secrets, he could no longer ignore the underlying question. Was the survival of humanity truly worth the price of so many lives? Was the Emperor's vision of unity and strength worth the absolute destruction of innocence? The answers eluded him, leaving him caught in a web of doubt and despair. But now, with the full weight of the truth crashing down on him, he realized that he had been a part of a system that not only accepted atrocity, but relied on it to maintain its power. The shock of this revelation left him reeling. How could he continue to serve an institution that built its power on such monstrous actions? He had believed that the Imperium's survival depended on these sacrifices, that the Emperor's vision of humanity's future required these terrible decisions. But now, he wasn't sure anymore. The institution he had dedicated his life to had become something entirely different from the ideal he had once believed in. It was not a force for good. It was a machine of terror built on the corpses of the innocent. The more Silas read, the more the truth became clear. The Imperium's survival did not depend on righteousness, it depended on fear. Fear was the tool used to enforce obedience. Fear kept the people in line, kept them loyal, and kept them from ever questioning the authority of the Emperor's servants. The brutal killings, the purges, the exterminations, they were all part of the system designed to maintain this fear, to keep the populace subjugated. But what terrified Silas the most was the realization that he had been a part of this machine for so long, believing that it was necessary, that it was for the greater good. His entire life had been spent in service to an institution that had become a monster. And now, as he read these records, he saw the full scope of what he had been complicit in. How could he continue? How could he live with himself knowing the truth? Silas couldn't stop the truth from eating away at him. The more he read, the more the truth of the Imperium's horrific methods became undeniable. The choices made by those in power were not just brutal, they were systematic, deliberate. What would Silas do with this knowledge? Could he keep serving the Imperium, or would he find a way to expose these truths to the galaxy? As Silas continued to sift through the records, his shock deepened. What he had initially thought were isolated instances of bureaucratic error or the tragic consequences of warfare were, in fact, part of a well-oiled machine of systematic cruelty. The Imperium, a vast empire stretching across the galaxy, did not just survive in spite of its brutality. It thrived because of it. The acts of mass destruction, the purging of entire worlds, were not just unfortunate byproducts of survival, they were the very foundation of the Imperium's existence. Each file he read painted the same grim picture. A galaxy in which survival was maintained through the elimination of anything that could be considered a threat to the Imperium's authority, no matter how small or insignificant. Silas was horrified to find that these acts were not outliers. They were standard procedure. The administrative mechanisms of the Imperium were built on an unyielding need to control, to eliminate any potential threat to its rule. The need for survival had been twisted into something monstrous, a desire for absolute power, maintained at any cost. The files revealed atrocities committed not for the survival of humanity, but for the convenience of its rulers. Take, for example, the case of the Forge world on Charadan V, where the entire population of workers who had exceeded their production quotas was executed. Not because of any heresy, but because they were deemed expendable by the Mechanicus. Their labor had reached its peak efficiency, and the mechanized administrators had no use for them anymore. It was easier to cycle through workers than risk exposing vital technological secrets. The destruction of a population, once deemed essential, had become a routine cost of doing business. Even more chilling was the extermination of an entire hive world in the Segmentum Obscurus. The world had faced food shortages, a recurring issue exacerbated by the ever-growing population. But rather than address the issue through redistribution or reform, the administratum decided that the simplest solution was to eliminate the population. The millions living in poverty were condemned not for any crime, but because their survival had become an inconvenient expense. The decision was made not because of any existential threat, but because their continued existence was deemed a drain on imperial resources. The destruction was not a last resort, it was the policy. Silas could not comprehend it at first. These were not the actions of a failing empire struggling to defend itself. These were the actions of an empire that had become a machine of absolute control, where the value of life had become nothing more than a calculation in a ledger. Innocent lives, people who had never known rebellion, never defied the emperor, were wiped out simply because they were deemed inefficient, because they stood in the way of the Imperium's unyielding quest for power. He began to notice patterns emerging in the documents he reviewed. The decisions were not based on logic or justice or necessity, they were based on convenience. If a planet's value to the Imperium became questionable, it was eliminated. If a colony became a financial drain or its population a potential source of dissent, it was eradicated. It wasn't a matter of survival at all. It was about maintaining an unchallengeable status quo, no matter the cost. Fear, terror, and oppression were the tools used to enforce this system, and they had become so deeply ingrained that no one, not even the highest-ranking inquisitors, questioned their necessity. And that was what disturbed Silas the most, the cold, unfeeling efficiency with which these decisions were made. The Imperium had become a place where human life had little value beyond its utility. The acts of mass extermination were no longer viewed as tragic necessities. They were viewed as routine. A necessary evil, perhaps, but ultimately an evil that was accepted as a standard operating procedure. And Silas, for all his years of service, had never questioned it. He had filed the records, cataloged the executions, and justified the violence because it was all done in the name of survival. But now, faced with the reality of what the Imperium had become, Silas could no longer reconcile his role in it. He had been a part of this machine for so long, believing in its righteousness. But now, with every page he turned, he saw only cruelty. The horror had ceased to be a byproduct of war. It had become the means by which the Imperium survived. And the deeper Silas went into the vaults, the more these realizations began to weigh on him. The documents didn't just detail random acts of violence, they outlined a philosophy. A philosophy that justified the annihilation of entire worlds, the systematic execution of innocent people, and the quiet erasure of lives deemed inconvenient for the Empire. This philosophy wasn't some corruption of the Imperium's ideals. It was the foundation upon which the Imperium stood. The only way to maintain its vastness was through terror, through fear, through the systematic destruction of those who stood in the way of its power. Silas was no longer just cataloging the atrocities. He was now questioning the very nature of the institution he had served for so long. The machines of war, the ceaseless purges, the endless cycles of death, they were all part of the same system. A system that demanded obedience at any cost. He had been a part of that system, complicit in its horrors, believing that it was necessary for humanity's survival. But now, as he faced the cold truth of what the Imperium truly was, he realized that survival was not enough. The Imperium was not fighting for humanity's survival. It was fighting to maintain its control at all costs, no matter the cost in lives. The realization struck Silas with devastating clarity. The Imperium did not just survive in spite of these horrors, it survived because of them. But could he continue to serve a system that had turned survival into a justification for genocide? As Silas's investigations deepened, he found himself unable to turn away from the truth now laid bare before him. The document he had uncovered, detailing the Imperium's justifications for mass purges, painted an even darker picture than he had imagined. He began to see that the cruelty he had always assumed was a byproduct of the Imperium's harsh survival tactics was, in fact, an integral part of its philosophy, something embedded deeply in the very foundation of the Empire's governance. The more he read, the clearer it became. The Imperium's survival did not hinge on virtue, righteousness, or moral high ground. The true pillars of the Imperium were built upon fear and control, systematic terror designed not just to keep humanity safe, but to keep it in line. The Inquisition, the Ordo Hereticus, and all the other branches of imperial authority did not simply combat external threats. They crushed internal dissent with such overwhelming force that it became indistinguishable from law. Every action, no matter how heinous, was justified under the guise of ensuring humanity's survival. The treatise Silas had found, The Necessity of Darkness, outlined this philosophy in chilling clarity. It argued that the only way to hold humanity together, to keep the vast expanse of the Imperium from fragmenting into chaos, was through absolute and unwavering control. This control could not afford to be merciful or compassionate. Such weaknesses could lead to the collapse of everything. If the Imperium allowed any form of deviation, any sign of independence, the fragile unity of humanity would fall apart, and the galaxy would descend into anarchy. To preserve the unity of the human race, the Imperium's rulers had embraced a harsh calculus, one that demanded the blood of innocents. Mercy, the treatise stated, was a luxury that humanity could no longer afford. It was a luxury that weakened the structure of the Imperium, a system that could only survive through the constant reinforcement of obedience. Loyalty, however blind, was the only guarantee of survival, and anyone who failed to adhere to that loyalty, whether through rebellion or mere inconvenience, was destined for eradication. The idea that mercy could play any part in the Imperium's long-term survival was dismissed as naive. Compassion was not just an inefficiency, it was a threat to the very fabric of the Empire. Silas could not reconcile this new understanding of the Imperium with what he had always believed. His entire life, he had thought he was serving a righteous cause. He had believed that the sacrifices made were necessary, that the violence carried out by the Emperor's servants was justified by the larger good. But now, the notion of larger good had been stripped away. What he saw was a cold, mechanical system of survival, one that used violence as a tool to maintain control over a vast, disparate humanity. The lives of billions were no longer important. What mattered was the survival of the machine, and for the machine to survive, the costs had to be paid in blood. He had been a part of this system for over 2 decades. He had believed that every death, every purge, every act of violence was a necessary evil, a small price to pay for the survival of the Imperium. But now, as he examined the philosophy that underpinned it all, he realized that the price of survival was not just high, it was monstrous. The Imperium had become an empire not of justice, but of terror. a place where control, obedience, and fear were valued above all else, and where the lives of innocent people were sacrificed not out of necessity, but out of convenience. And yet the horrifying truth continued to unfold. The documents he uncovered detailed not just isolated incidents of cruelty, but a systematic foundational practice. This was not the result of a few corrupt officials abusing their power. This was the bedrock on which the Imperium stood. Every act of violence, every extermination order, was part of a larger strategy designed to ensure humanity's continued existence at any cost. The logic behind these decisions was not one of desperation, but one of cold efficiency. The lives of individuals, the souls of millions, were expendable to the greater cause of imperial stability. As Silas read through more records, his understanding of the Imperium continued to shift. He learned that entire sectors had been purged for reasons that seemed trivial in comparison to the devastation they caused. One file described a planet that had been destroyed simply because its population had begun to demand more autonomy. The local government had tried to implement reforms to improve the quality of life, but these reforms threatened the power structure of the Imperium. Rather than allow this potential for change to spread, the planet was cleansed, its entire population wiped out to maintain control and prevent further unrest. The reason for the destruction was simple. If even a single world dared to question the Imperium's absolute authority, it could spark a movement that might unravel the whole system. The more Silas uncovered, the more he realized that the Imperium was not just a brutal authoritarian regime. It was a system that had deliberately, methodically built its power by perpetuating fear and violence. The Imperium was not a nation defending itself from external threats. It was a machine that operated through the constant, calculated elimination of anything that might threaten its unchallenged supremacy. Every death, every tragedy, every act of cruelty was justified under the guise of survival. But Silas knew now that the survival the Imperium sought was not one of righteousness, but one of absolute, unyielding control. Silas now understood the true nature of the Imperium and its dark philosophy, but what could he do with this knowledge? Could he continue to serve a system that had turned survival into a justification for cruelty, or would he find a way to resist the suffocating grip of the Inquisition? His next steps would determine his fate and the fate of his conscience. The more Silas examined the records, the deeper his understanding of the Imperium's philosophy became, and the more he realized just how entrenched this philosophy was within the very fabric of imperial governance. He thought back to the Inquisitor's treatise he had uncovered, The Necessity of Darkness. This was the document that underpinned the rationale for the cold, calculating brutality Silas had seen unfold before him. It was not merely a set of policies. It was an ideology, an unshakable belief that to preserve humanity, the Imperium had to maintain absolute control over its citizens, using fear, violence, and terror as tools of governance. The treatise explained that in a galaxy so hostile to humanity's existence, the Imperium's survival depended not on virtue or justice, but on total dominance. The vast expanse of the Imperium, with its myriad worlds, could not be held together through diplomacy, peace, or mutual respect. These things were luxuries that could only be afforded to the privileged few. For everyone else, survival meant obedience, and obedience meant subjugation. If the Imperium allowed even the slightest deviation from the prescribed order, if one world or one individual was permitted to question the Emperor's authority, the entire empire risked collapse. This was the logic that the Inquisition used to justify the cleansing protocols that Silas had been cataloging. To the Imperium's leaders, the survival of humanity was the highest ideal, and any sacrifice, no matter how great, was deemed necessary to maintain that survival. The belief in absolute obedience had become so ingrained in the system that it was no longer questioned. For those in power, the destruction of innocent populations, the purging of worlds, and the execution of entire populations had become standard procedure. These actions were not seen as tragedies, but as necessary steps to ensure that the Imperium remained whole. The most disturbing realization that Silas had to face was that the Imperium didn't merely tolerate cruelty. It depended on it. The system had become so accustomed to violence that it no longer recognized it for what it truly was, atrocity. Instead, it had been transformed into a cold, administrative task, with every action justified by the highest authorities as an unavoidable consequence of the Imperium's need for control. The documents he read revealed that the Inquisitor lords and other high-ranking officials understood the gravity of their decisions. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were not ignorant of the suffering they caused, but they were convinced that this suffering was the price humanity had to pay to endure in a universe that offered no mercy. And therein lay the core of the necessity of darkness. The document argued that humanity could never hope to survive in the galaxy without a ruthless and unyielding hand guiding it. The Emperor's vision of a unified humanity had become warped over millennia, evolving from a dream of cooperation into a nightmare of coercion. The ideals of mercy, compassion, and justice had been discarded as outdated notions, replaced by a brutal pragmatism that justified any means as long as they served the greater goal of preserving the Imperium's dominance. For Silas, this realization was the final blow to his long-held beliefs. For so long, he had justified his work, believing that the Imperium's actions, no matter how extreme, were a necessary evil. He had told himself that the sacrifices were required to protect humanity from the horrors that lay beyond the Imperium's walls. But now, faced with the cold truth of what he had uncovered, Silas understood that the Imperium's cruelty was not a byproduct of necessity. It was the foundation upon which the Empire was built. The question that had plagued him now became impossible to ignore. What had humanity become? The Imperium, in its effort to survive, had created a world where the value of a life was dictated solely by its utility. People were no longer individuals with hopes, dreams, and fears. They were cogs in a machine, their lives weighed against the needs of the system. The lives of millions were destroyed not for the greater good, but because they became a burden to the Imperium's vast and unyielding bureaucracy. Silas had spent years of his life cataloging these atrocities, believing that he was serving the Imperium, preserving its history for future generations. But now he realized that the history he had been documenting was not one of heroism and survival. It was a history of blind obedience, systematic cruelty, and the destruction of innocent lives. He had been complicit in this system for over 2 decades, faithfully recording each death as if it were part of some greater plan. But now he saw the truth: there was no greater plan, there was only control. As Silas sat in the silence of the vaults, the weight of his discoveries became unbearable. The Imperium's foundations were not built on wisdom, but on fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of autonomy, fear of losing control. The destruction of innocent populations was not an anomaly, it was policy. And Silas had been a part of that policy, serving in a system that thrived on cruelty. With the truth now laid bare before him, Silas faced a choice he never thought he would have to make. Could he continue to serve the Imperium, knowing what he now knew, or would he find a way to expose the horrors he had uncovered, even if it meant sacrificing his own life? The realization that the very foundation of the Imperium was built on calculated cruelty tore through Silas's mind like a storm. He had always thought he understood his place in the vast machine of the Imperium, but now, standing in the midst of this horrific truth, he couldn't ignore the gnawing conflict inside him. He had served the Emperor for over 2 decades, faithfully transcribing records of destruction and betrayal. He had believed in the necessity of those sacrifices, rationalized them as part of the larger strategy to preserve humanity from the darker forces of the galaxy. But now he could no longer justify it. The horror of what he had been complicit in was undeniable, and it seemed to consume him from within. Each day, the weight of his discoveries pressed down harder on his shoulders. The documents he had uncovered did not simply describe individual acts of violence. They detailed an intricate system, a philosophical framework that justified the slaughter of innocents as an essential tool for maintaining the Imperium's power. The doctrine of the necessity of darkness had become the cornerstone of imperial survival. The Emperor's vision, once a beacon of hope and unity, had evolved into something much darker. The survival of humanity, according to this doctrine, required not just the defeat of external enemies, but the systematic oppression and elimination of any deviation, any threat to the singular vision of imperial control. Silas thought back to the many years he had spent cataloging atrocities with the belief that it was for the greater good. Each file he had reviewed, each report he had filed away, had been done with the understanding that these were necessary sacrifices. But now, looking at those same reports, he saw only the cold, calculated decisions of bureaucrats who had lost sight of the value of life. The idea that human life could be discarded so easily, so efficiently, for the sake of a more orderly galaxy made him sick. The Imperium had not only become a machine of survival, it had become a machine of oppression. As Silas sat in the vaults, poring over the records, he felt the walls of his reality crumble. He had always believed in the cause, in the righteousness of the Imperium's mission. But now he was forced to confront the brutal truth. The Imperium did not fight for humanity's survival, it fought for its own perpetuation at any cost. The systems of control, fear, and violence were not anomalies within the Imperium, they were integral to its very survival. It was a survival that required the constant destruction of lives, the erasure of whole populations, simply because they had become a problem for the system. There was no honor, no justice in this, only efficiency and ruthlessness. Silas knew he could not continue in this role. The very knowledge he had acquired, the truth he had uncovered, had fundamentally altered him. He could not go back to his previous life, filing reports and accepting the violence as part of the cost of survival. The weight of his discoveries had shattered his faith in the Imperium, in the Emperor's vision, and in his own place within it. He knew that he had been part of something monstrous, something that used the promise of salvation to justify the destruction of innocent lives. And that was something he could no longer be a part of. The choices before him were as clear as they were bleak. Silas could attempt to expose the truth to the galaxy, to reveal the atrocities he had uncovered, but he knew that it would be a futile act. The Inquisition's reach was vast, and its ability to suppress any inconvenient truth was unmatched. Any attempt to broadcast his findings would be erased, and his name would be added to the long list of those who had tried to shine light into places where darkness was forbidden. It was a path that led only to death, to becoming another disappeared name, another casualty of the system he had once served. Another option was to flee, to disappear into the depths of the Imperium and escape the reach of the Inquisition. But Silas knew that this was not a true escape. The Imperium's surveillance network was too vast, and the long arm of the Inquisition stretched to the furthest corners of the galaxy. If he fled, he would only become more of a target. His name would be erased from the records, and his existence would be forgotten. But he would still be hunted, and his death would still come eventually. And then there was the option to continue his service, to accept what he had learned and transform. He could embrace the logic of survival just as those Inquisitor lords had. He could suppress his conscience, silence his doubts, and return to his work with the cold efficiency that the Imperium demanded. He could become like those he had once looked up to, ruthless, pragmatic, a servant of a system that saw people as nothing more than tools in a grand, cosmic game. But even as this option presented itself, Silas recoiled at the thought of becoming like them. He had seen what that transformation did to others. It turned them into something less than human, something devoid of empathy and compassion. The choice, Silas realized, was not between loyalty to the Imperium or defection. It was between continuing to serve a machine that destroyed lives for the sake of control, or standing up for something that could no longer exist within the Imperium. His conscience, it was not a choice that would change the fate of the galaxy, but it was a choice that would determine his own fate. Would he remain a cog in the machine, a servant who executed orders without question? Or would he become an anomaly, someone who refused to surrender his humanity even in the face of certain destruction? Silas knew that the path of defiance would lead to death. It would be a slow, agonizing death, as the Inquisition hunted him down, erased his name from existence, and buried the truth with him. But at least he would die knowing that he had not become complicit in the horrors he had uncovered. He would die with his integrity intact, refusing to be part of a system that dehumanized and destroyed for the sake of survival. With a clear resolve, Silas knew what he had to do. But the Inquisition was watching, and the moment he made his decision, it would become a matter of life and death. Would he be able to stand his ground, or would he be swallowed up by the very system he sought to defy? Silas woke on the morning of his decision with a quiet resolve that had settled deep within him over the past few days. The previous nights had been filled with restless thoughts, dreams of exterminated worlds, of millions of innocent lives erased in the name of convenience. Each of these nights had served to clarify his path forward. He could no longer live under the shadow of the lies he had told himself for years, and he knew that he could not continue serving a system that saw human lives as mere statistics in a spreadsheet. The truth had taken root in his soul, and there was no going back. The days spent in the archives had shown him the horrors of the Imperium's methods. The idea that the Imperium was simply protecting humanity from the horrors of the universe had once been enough for him to accept the mass deaths he had catalogued. Now he knew the truth, that the Imperium was not fighting to preserve humanity but to maintain its power. And to do so, it was willing to sacrifice anything, including innocent lives, without hesitation or remorse. The survival of the Imperium had become the justification for all crimes. What Silas had once believed to be sacrifices for the greater good had proven to be nothing more than cold, calculated actions to ensure control. As he dressed in the simple robes of his office, the weight of the codex he had compiled rested heavily on his mind. He had finished it, yes, but the work was not the culmination of his duty, it was his final act of defiance. The codex, complete in every way, was filled with detailed accounts of the Operation Cleansing protocols. It was a meticulous piece of work, a thorough analysis of the Inquisition's actions over the centuries. But more than that, it was an indictment of the entire system. It was a document that revealed the grim truth that the Imperium's survival was based on the elimination of those who no longer served its purposes, and that no act of cruelty, no matter how horrific, was beyond the scope of the system's rationale. The door to his cell clicked open and Silas stepped into the hallway. His footsteps echoed in the quiet, and he passed through the silent halls of the fortress monastery. The other archivists went about their duties, heads down, focused on their tasks. None of them looked up as he walked past, but Silas could feel the eyes on him, could sense the weight of their judgment. They knew, they all knew. They knew that he had seen the truth, and they knew what that meant for him. His path led him to the Maglev platform, where the long journey to the Inquisitor Lord Morn's chambers would begin. The platform doors slid open, and Silas stepped inside. As the lift descended through the fortress's dark, hollow corridors, his mind wandered back to the moment when he first entered the vaults. He had believed that he was simply doing his duty, faithfully serving the Imperium. Now those same corridors felt alien to him. The very walls seemed to close in, as if they were a reminder of the suffocating weight of the truth he carried. The fortress monastery, with its cold stone walls, its oppressive silence, had once felt like home. Now it felt like a tomb, a place where men and women were buried alive beneath the weight of their own complicity. Silas had been one of them, but no longer. He had seen beyond the veil of obedience, and the truth had shattered the foundation of everything he had once believed. The platform reached its destination, and the doors opened with a soft hiss. Silas stepped out, and the two guards at the entrance to Inquisitor Morn's chambers regarded him with silent, impassive expressions. They did not question his presence, they did not need to. They already knew who he was, and they already knew why he was here. The decision had been made long before he had even entered the vaults. Inquisitor Lord Morn stood by the windows, his back to Silas, staring out at the cold, distant landscape beyond the fortress. His silhouette was framed by the dim light filtering through the clouds. Morn's gray eyes, always calculating, always distant, seemed to sense Silas's arrival before the archivist spoke. Without turning, Morn addressed him. "You've had your time, Silas," Morn said, his voice as cold and emotionless as ever. "You've had your time to consider. You know the consequences of your choice. We both know what you will decide." Silas stood silently, feeling the weight of Morn's words pressing down on him. He had expected this. He had known that the Inquisitor would offer him a path of transformation, a way to embrace the cold pragmatism of the system he had just uncovered. But he also knew that accepting that path would mean surrendering everything he had left of his own humanity. The final choice was upon him. He had spent hours contemplating his options. To transform, to accept the Imperium's rationale, to become just another cog in the machine. Or to refuse, to remain true to the conscience that had survived the horrors of the vaults, even at the cost of his life. The first path was the one of survival, the one of compromise. The second path was the one of defiance, but it would lead only to death. Silas knew that whatever decision he made, it would be the last one he ever made. But would he accept the system's cold pragmatism, or would he choose to die as himself, holding on to the last shred of humanity he had left? Silas stood before Inquisitor Lord Morn, the codex still clutched in his hands, a final testament to everything he had uncovered. Morn's cold eyes pierced him, and for a moment, Silas felt as though the entire weight of the Imperium was bearing down on him. The moment had arrived, the moment where the path forward would be decided. There was no turning back. The choice was clear, but the consequences of whichever path he chose would shape the rest of his life or end it entirely. Morn, as expected, did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice remained steady, devoid of emotion, but the weight of his words carried more than enough gravity. "You've had your time to reflect, Silas. You've seen the truth, and now you know the cost of that knowledge. You also know the consequences of rejecting it." Silas felt a tightness in his chest, as if the very air around him had thickened, turning suffocating. In that moment, the fortress monastery felt like a tomb, his tomb, an inescapable place of judgment where the silence of the archives would soon consume him. He had always been a servant of the Imperium, faithfully documenting its history, its battles, its atrocities, and its supposed victories. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of that history on his shoulders. The truth was no longer abstract, it was personal. It was his own soul that would be sacrificed for the sake of the Imperium's survival. Morn, still staring out the window, spoke again. "The path before you is simple. You can accept the necessary transformation. You can embrace the pragmatism that has allowed the Imperium to survive for so long without question or doubt. You can become one of us, someone who understands the cost of survival, someone who is willing to make the hard decisions without hesitation." Silas's mind reeled as he processed the Inquisitor's words. He knew what Morn was offering him. It was not just a promotion, not just a chance to continue serving. It was an offer to embrace the very darkness that Silas had uncovered, the acceptance of violence, of control, of terror as necessary tools in the survival of humanity. It was the acceptance of everything he had learned, the turning away from the conscience that had led him this far. It was the path that would allow him to continue to live, to survive, but it would cost him his humanity. The second option, as Morn had already indicated, was to refuse. To reject the transformation, to refuse to become one of the Inquisitors, to remain true to the soul that still questioned the Imperium's brutal methods. But in rejecting this path, Silas knew what would happen. He would be erased. His name would be expunged from all records. His existence would be erased from the Imperium's memory. He would die, but not as a hero. He would die a symbol of defiance, a martyr for a cause that would never be acknowledged, a footnote in a long list of names that had been quietly forgotten. The problem, Silas realized, was that he had no illusions left. The decision was not about choosing between loyalty to the Emperor and defiance of the system. It was about choosing between two forms of death, one slow, one immediate. And there was no real victory to be found in either. The Imperium would continue, as it always had, regardless of whether he accepted it or not. The machine of war and oppression would grind on, consuming innocent lives and perpetuating the cycle of terror, with or without Silas's participation. But Silas also understood something else, something that had been dawning on him over the past few days. Survival was not worth losing himself. The Inquisition had shown him that the price of survival was too high, too costly for him to pay. He had come to believe that the system, for all its cruelty, was necessary for humanity's survival. But now, he knew that it wasn't just the survival of the Imperium at stake, it was his own humanity. He glanced down at the codex in his hands, the weight of it now symbolic of everything he had uncovered. The knowledge that he could never undo, the truths that had shattered his faith. He knew that this final decision would be his last act of defiance. The choice had already been made. He could no longer be a part of this machine. Silas finally spoke, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "I refuse." There was no dramatic outburst, no final plea for mercy, no attempt to explain or justify his decision. Silas had come to terms with it. This was not about winning or losing. This was about maintaining his integrity even at the cost of his life. It was the only thing he had left. Morn turned, his expression unreadable, but the faintest flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps understanding, flashed in his eyes. He said nothing for a moment, simply staring at Silas as if weighing him in some unseen balance. "You understand what this means?" Morn finally asked, his voice low. "I do," Silas answered quietly, "but I can no longer serve a system that I cannot justify." Morn's gaze never wavered. "Then you are prepared for what comes next?" Silas nodded, the finality of his decision settling over him. There was no going back, no escape from the consequences of his choice. He had accepted that he would die, but he would do so knowing he had remained true to himself. The Imperium would continue its work just as it had before, but Silas would not be a part of it anymore. He would not allow himself to be consumed by the darkness that had overtaken it. As Silas stood in front of the Inquisitor, the silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick. In the depths of his heart, he knew the Inquisitor's next move would be the last. But would Morn honor his defiance, or would he try to silence Silas forever? The silence between Silas and Inquisitor Lord Morn stretched on, thick and heavy. For a moment, Silas felt as though the weight of the entire galaxy was pressing down on him. He had made his decision, had rejected the life Morn offered, and yet the finality of his choice hung in the air, suspended between them. There was no turning back now, Silas knew that. The path he had chosen would lead only to death, but it would be a death of his own making, a death where his soul would remain his own, untainted by the system he had once served. Morn stood still, his expression inscrutable as if weighing Silas's resolve. The two men were locked in a silent battle of wills, each aware of the inevitable outcome. Silas could feel the eyes of the Inquisitor on him, as if he were reading every thought, every tremor of doubt that might pass through his mind. But Silas remained calm, his heart steady, knowing that this was the only way forward. Morn broke the silence first, his voice quiet and even though it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "You understand what you're saying, Silas. You're choosing to die rather than continue to serve the Imperium. Do you think that will change anything? Do you think your death will alter the course of this galaxy? The Imperium will continue as it always has. Your defiance, your refusal to serve, will be nothing more than a footnote in a long list of those who have come before you." Silas met Morn's gaze without flinching. He had expected this. He had expected the Inquisitor to attempt to break him, to convince him that his death would be futile, meaningless. But Silas was no longer the man who had faithfully served the Imperium for decades. He was someone else now, someone who had seen the truth behind the machine, someone who could no longer justify the atrocities he had once believed were necessary. "I don't expect my death to change anything," Silas said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I know that the Imperium will continue, that the machine will keep grinding forward, but my death is my choice and that is the only thing I have left." I refuse to become another cog in a system built on lies and cruelty. Morn regarded him with an unreadable expression, his gray eyes calculating as though he were searching for something within Silas, some trace of doubt, some weakness to exploit. But Silas stood firm. He had made his decision and he would not back down. He would die with his integrity intact, knowing that he had chosen to stand against the very system that had shaped his life. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the faint hum of the fortress's machinery. Silas could feel the weight of Morn's gaze on him, but he didn't look away. He would not allow himself to be intimidated, not anymore. Finally, Morn spoke again, his voice low but tinged with something like admiration. You have courage, Silas, I will give you that. Few would choose to die rather than serve. But know this, your defiance will not save you. The Imperium does not tolerate those who reject its will. You will be erased, forgotten, and in the end it will change nothing. Silas nodded, accepting the finality of Morn's words. He had known that his death would be meaningless in the grand scheme of the Imperium. His defiance would not alter the course of history, nor would it change the system that had enslaved countless souls. But it would change him. It would restore his humanity, even if only in his final moments. I understand, Silas replied, his voice steady, but I would rather die with my conscience intact than live as a tool of oppression. The Imperium is not humanity's salvation, it is its prison, and I refuse to be a part of it any longer. Morn's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he were considering Silas's words, measuring the finality of his decision. Very well, he said at last. You have made your choice, and now you will face the consequences. Without another word, Morn turned toward the door of the chamber, signaling that Silas should follow. Silas knew what was coming. He had known from the moment he made his decision. The Inquisitor was not here to offer mercy. He was here to ensure that Silas's defiance would be snuffed out before it could spread, before it could inspire others to question the system. As Silas followed Morn, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The decision was made. There was no turning back. He had chosen this path, and though it would lead to his death, it was a death that he could accept. He would not die in silence, nor would he die as a servant of the machine. He would die as a man who had refused to compromise his conscience, a man who had chosen to stand against the tide of tyranny, even knowing it would cost him everything. Silas knew the end was near, but the final moment had not yet come. Would he face his death with dignity, or would Morn's next move shatter the last remnants of his defiance? Silas followed Inquisitor Lord Morn through the cold, sterile halls of the fortress monastery, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though he were walking toward his own execution. But there was no fear in him, not anymore. His mind was clear and his resolve unwavering. He had chosen this path, and he would face whatever came with the same quiet determination. Morn did not speak as they walked, and Silas did not attempt to break the silence. He could feel the tension between them, the unspoken understanding that this was the final moment. There would be no turning back, no last-minute change of heart. Silas had rejected the Imperium's offer, had chosen to defy it, and now the consequences would come. He knew he would not survive this. But in his heart he felt a strange peace, knowing that he would die with his humanity intact. The two reached the central chamber of the fortress, a grand hall filled with towering statues of the Emperor and the saints who had helped shape the Imperium. It was a place of reverence, a place where the Inquisitors made their most important decisions. It was here that Silas had spent countless hours, cataloging the deeds of the Emperor's servants, preserving the history of the Imperium. Now it felt like the tomb of his own life, a place where he would finally be laid to rest. Morn turned to face him as they reached the center of the chamber. His expression was unreadable, but Silas could sense a certain finality in the air. The Inquisitor's cold eyes studied him, as though he were an interesting specimen, something to be dissected and analyzed. You made your choice, Silas, Morn said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of menace. You refused to become part of the system, to accept your place in the greater order of things. You chose defiance over survival, and now you will face the consequences of that choice. Silas met Morn's gaze with steady eyes. I know what's coming, Morn, but I would rather die knowing the truth than live as a slave to a lie. Morn's lips twisted into a thin smile, though there was no warmth in it. You speak of truth, but you fail to understand the reality of the situation. The truth is that the Imperium will survive with or without you. Your defiance is nothing more than a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things. In the end, you will be forgotten, and the Imperium will continue unyielding and unbroken. Silas felt a surge of anger, but he kept it under control. He had made his peace with the fact that he would die, but he would not let Morn's words break him. The Imperium's survival did not matter to him anymore. What mattered was that he had made the right choice, that he had stayed true to his conscience. He would not let Morn take that from him. You're wrong, Silas said quietly. The Imperium will continue, yes, but it will never be the same. It will never be as pure as it once was because it is built on lies and bloodshed, and one day it will crumble under the weight of its own cruelty. Morn's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold indifference. We shall see, Silas, but it matters little now. You've made your choice and you will face the consequences. With a sudden, swift motion, Morn gestured to the two guards who had been standing silently at the far end of the chamber. They stepped forward, their weapons drawn, their eyes cold and emotionless. Silas knew this was the end. He had known it from the moment he rejected Morn's offer. But even as the guards approached, Silas remained calm, his head held high. He would not die begging for mercy. He would die standing defiant to the end. One of the guards moved toward him, a blaster rifle in hand, while the other took position behind him. Silas felt a slight tremor in his hand, but he quickly steadied himself. There was no fear, only the sense of finality. He had chosen this path, and now it was time to face the end. His life had been a part of the Imperium's machine for so long, but now, in these final moments, he was free. Free from the lies, free from the complicity, free from the weight of the system that had bound him for so long. The guard raised his rifle and Silas's heart raced for a moment, but then everything went still. His mind cleared. In the silence, all he could hear was his own breath, steady and calm. He had made his peace. This was the end of his story, the last chapter of his life. The rifle aimed at his chest, and Silas stood, unflinching, waiting for the inevitable. And then, in that moment of absolute stillness, something unexpected happened. Morn raised his hand, stopping the guard. Silas blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You wish to die as a martyr, Silas," Morn said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "But there is more to this than you realize." Silas's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Morn's cold gaze remained fixed on him. "You think that by rejecting us you are somehow preserving your honor. But you are not. You are simply ensuring that the system will never have to account for your truth. The Imperium will move on without you, as it always has. Your death will be meaningless, and yet you stand here, willing to die for nothing more than a fleeting sense of righteousness." Silas shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "My death will not be for nothing. I die with the truth, that is all I can offer." Morn remained silent for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he motioned for the guards to lower their weapons. "You will not die today, Silas," Morn said, his voice colder than ever. "But know this, your defiance has sealed your fate. You will live out the rest of your days knowing that the Imperium will never be brought to justice, no matter how many truths you uncover." Silas felt a strange sense of relief. The end was not yet here, but his defiance had been acknowledged. He would not die today, but he would never again be a part of the system he had once served. And for Silas, that was enough. Silas stood in the silence that followed, unsure of what the future held. His fate was no longer sealed by his refusal to comply, but by something darker, a life bound to the Imperium's shadow. Would he live to see another day, or would Morn's words be the beginning of a new, darker chapter in his life? The tension in the room remained palpable, but Silas found himself unable to fully comprehend what had just transpired. For a moment, he had been certain that his life would end in that cold, sterile chamber, that the Inquisitor's word would be the last he ever heard. But now, as the guards lowered their weapons and the silence stretched between him and Morn, something shifted in the air. Silas could feel the weight of Morn's eyes on him, but now there was no immediate threat of death, only the chilling realization that something far more insidious was at play. Morn did not speak for a long time, his gaze never wavering. Silas felt as though he were being studied, dissected in ways far beyond what he had ever imagined. The Inquisitor seemed to be weighing his soul, perhaps trying to gauge whether his defiance had truly come from a place of righteous anger or if it was simply the foolishness of a man who had seen too much. "Your decision," Morn said finally, his voice cold and calculated, "has made things complicated." He paused, and Silas could see a flicker of something in Morn's eyes, something akin to both respect and disdain. "You think that defiance is a moral victory, Silas, but I have seen countless men and women like you. They stand in opposition to the system, refusing to serve, and in doing so, they believe they are preserving their integrity. But in reality, they are condemning themselves to irrelevance." Silas felt a surge of anger, but he clamped down on it. His time for anger had long passed. His decisions were already made, and he had accepted the consequences, no matter how grim they were. "You can kill me, Morn," Silas said, his voice steady, "but you cannot silence the truth. What I know will never die." Morn's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You still do not understand. Your death would not silence the truth. It would only erase you. The truth, as you see it, is an illusion that has no place in the reality of the Imperium. You think that your death would somehow expose the cruelty of the system, but it would do nothing of the sort. The system will carry on as it always has, with or without you." Silas met Morn's gaze with defiance. "The system may continue, but it will never be the same. It will continue on a path built on lies, on the destruction of innocent lives. It will continue, but the cost of that survival will eventually crush it from within. Morn's expression hardened. You speak as if the Imperium is some fragile thing, something that can be undone by a single man's defiance, but you are wrong. The Imperium is not fragile. It is built on the blood of the innocent, yes. But it is also built on the obedience of the masses, on the loyalty of those who choose to serve without question. And for every defiant soul like you, there are 1,000 others who will carry on the work, who will never question the Imperium's purpose. Silas took a deep breath, his mind racing with the weight of Morn's words. What Morn was saying was true. There would always be those who followed the path of obedience, those who never questioned the system, who never saw beyond the lies they were fed. The Imperium was a machine, one that fed on the loyalty of its servants, even when those servants were blind to its true nature. But Silas could no longer be one of them. He could no longer be a part of something that would sacrifice innocent lives for the sake of control. "And what about me?" Silas asked, his voice softer but still resolute. "What will you do with someone who refuses to serve the system? Someone who has seen the truth and cannot unsee it?" Morn's eyes narrowed, his voice growing colder. "You will be kept alive, Silas, but not as you think. The truth you cling to, the moral high ground you believe you stand on, it has no place in this world. You will live, but you will never be allowed to spread your lies. You will remain here under my watch, and you will be kept in silence. Your life will be preserved, but it will mean nothing. You will serve as a reminder of the cost of defiance, and you will never again be able to speak the truth." The weight of Morn's words hit Silas like a hammer. This was not the death he had expected. This was something far worse. A life without purpose, a life where he would be forced to live on, to breathe, but never to act, never to speak again. It was a form of imprisonment, not of the body, but of the soul. Silas felt the walls close in around him, the realization sinking in that his defiance had come with a price he had not anticipated. He had thought that by choosing to die, he could preserve his integrity, his sense of righteousness. But instead, he was being condemned to live as a prisoner of his own beliefs. A man who had rejected the Imperium's machine only to become a part of it in a way he had never imagined. "Is that your idea of justice?" Silas asked, his voice bitter. "To imprison me, to strip me of everything I am, all in the name of maintaining control?" Morn's expression softened just slightly, but there was no compassion in it. "No, Silas, this is not about justice. It's about survival, and the Imperium will survive with or without you. But I am giving you the opportunity to live. I am giving you a place in this world, even if you cannot see it as anything more than a cage." Silas felt the cold grip of despair tighten around him, but even then there was a small part of him that refused to yield. He would not let Morn's words break him. He would not let the Inquisitor's twisted form of survival define him. "If my life is a cage," Silas said, his voice steady, "then I will wait, because the truth does not die. Not while I still breathe." Morn's cold gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before he nodded. "Very well, live with that truth, but know this, Silas, you will never be allowed to speak it." As Silas was escorted from the chamber, the weight of the situation settled upon him. He had chosen defiance, but the price was not what he had expected. The life he had once known, the life he had believed in, was gone. In its place stood a shadow of survival, an existence that was both meaningless and endless. And so Silas was forced to live on, trapped in a cage of his own making. But as the years passed, he knew one thing with certainty: the truth he had discovered would never be forgotten, no matter how much the Imperium tried to bury it. Silas's new life, though bound by the Imperium's cold logic, was not without hope. He had been silenced but not broken. Would his defiance continue to burn within him, or would the weight of his imprisonment eventually extinguish the last flicker of rebellion? Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Silas found himself in a kind of limbo. His life, once filled with purpose, though corrupted by the system he had served, now felt like an endless void. He had rejected the Imperium, defied it in the most direct way he could, but in doing so he had condemned himself to an existence far worse than death. He was alive, but he was nothing more than a shadow. A prisoner bound not by chains, but by the weight of his own conscience. He had been moved to a remote section of the fortress, far from the eyes of his former colleagues, far from the central hub of the Inquisition's operations. The room he was kept in was sparse, with only the barest of furnishings. A simple cot, a desk, and a single chair. The walls were cold stone, devoid of any decoration or warmth. There was nothing in the room that spoke of humanity or life. It was a place designed for the soul to wither, for the mind to unravel in isolation. The silence was deafening. The Inquisitors had given him a simple directive: to remain silent, to do nothing. He was not allowed to write, not allowed to speak, not allowed to share the truth he had uncovered. His punishment was not death, it was the obliteration of his identity, the erasure of his existence. They had not killed him physically, but they had killed the man he had once been. They had left him a living corpse, trapped in a cage of his own making, but with no one to hear his cries. But even in this silence, even in this solitude, Silas's mind remained sharp. His conscience, though buried under the weight of his imprisonment, still burned with the truth he had uncovered. He could not and would not forget the horrors of the Imperium. No matter how much they tried to suppress him, no matter how much they tried to erase him, the truth still lived within him. It was a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how cold the walls around him grew. At first, Silas had been consumed with despair. The weight of his isolation was unbearable, and there were moments when he wondered if he would simply wither away in this forgotten corner of the Imperium. But as the days passed, a quiet resistance began to form within him. It wasn't a resistance that would challenge the Imperium head-on, nor one that could be seen by the world. It was something quieter, something that could not be erased by the Inquisitors. It was the resistance of the mind, the soul, the heart. Every day, Silas spent hours reflecting on the truth he had uncovered. He had seen the darkness within the Imperium, the cruelty that had been baked into the very structure of the Empire. He had seen how easily the lives of the innocent were discarded in the name of survival. But despite it all, he also knew something else. The Imperium was built on fear, on control, and on terror, but it was not invincible. It was a system that thrived because its people feared the consequences of defying it, but the truth had power. The truth could break the chains that held humanity in its grip. As Silas sat in his cell, his hands trembling from the long periods of stillness, he began to craft a quiet plan, one that would not expose him, but that would, in time, plant the seeds of rebellion. He knew that he could not bring down the Imperium on his own. He could not stand against the vast forces that had crushed him. But he also knew that the Imperium's power depended on the obedience of its people. And if the truth could reach them, if it could find its way into the hearts and minds of those who still believed in the righteousness of the Imperium, then it could begin to chip away at the walls of control. The Inquisition may have silenced his voice, but they could not silence his thoughts. They could not erase the truth that burned within him. Every day, Silas wrote in secret notes, drawings, diagrams of the Imperium's atrocities. It was not the kind of writing that would topple empires, but it was the kind of writing that could awaken souls. He hid his writings beneath the floorboards of his cell, covered by the dust and grime of his solitary existence. As the months passed, Silas began to form a quiet connection with the other prisoners held in the fortress. They were not political rebels or ideologues. Many of them were simple people who had crossed the wrong line, who had spoken out of turn or dared to challenge the authority of the Imperium in small ways. They had been silenced, locked away for crimes as minor as dissent or defiance. They were the forgotten ones, those who had been cast aside by the machine. Silas had not expected to find kinship among them, but he did. And though they had no power to challenge the Imperium, they shared one thing with him, a common understanding that the system they had all served was not as it seemed. They had all, in their own ways, suffered under the weight of its cruelty, and in their silence, in their shared suffering, there was a quiet bond. Silas began to share his ideas with them, not in words, but in gestures, in small, covert actions. He would slide a scrap of paper under the door of their cells containing a simple question: what is truth? It was a question that began to stir something deep inside them. They began to whisper, quietly at first, then with growing intensity, the same thoughts that had once burned inside Silas's own mind. They began to question. The days blended together, but Silas felt something shift. The quiet resistance he had nurtured in solitude was slowly growing, expanding like a fire that threatened to spread beyond the walls of his cell. It was not the grand, violent uprising he had once imagined, but it was a beginning. He knew that he would never live to see the full effect of his actions. He knew that the Imperium would not fall because of one man's defiance. But the truth had power, and if it could spread, it would eventually find its way into the hearts of those who still believed. Silas had become a silent thorn in the side of the Imperium, a man who would not be forgotten, a man who refused to be erased. The resistance was small, silent, and barely noticeable, but it was growing. And as Silas looked out at the bleak horizon of his prison, he wondered, how long could the Imperium keep the truth hidden from those who had yet to see it? Would they find a way to destroy him before his seeds of rebellion could grow? Time passed in the cold, oppressive silence of Silas's prison. The days blurred together in an unbroken cycle of routine and isolation, but Silas had come to find a strange sense of peace in his solitude. The harshness of his imprisonment, the relentless quiet, and the utter absence of purpose in his daily life had become his new reality. Yet, even in the deepest corners of this barren existence, Silas found ways to keep his spirit alive. The rebellion he had started quietly, secretly, was beginning to grow, and with it, the smallest glimmer of hope. He had long since stopped counting the days, for in his mind, time was a luxury that only those with a future could afford. But there were moments, fleeting but profound, when he could feel the shift. When he heard whispers in the hallways, low murmurs that carried more weight than they appeared to at first glance. The prisoners who had once been completely defeated, broken by their confinement, were slowly coming together. A shared understanding had begun to form among them. Silas had planted the seed of rebellion, not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with small, subtle actions that had begun to resonate with the forgotten souls around him. In the beginning, the scraps of paper he left under his fellow prisoners' doors had been simple: a question, a statement, sometimes a drawing of the horrors he had uncovered in the archives. What is truth? He had written over and over again. It was the question that had tormented him for so long, the question that had sparked his own defiance, and now it was the question that was spreading like wildfire among the prisoners. At first, no one responded. The fear of speaking out, of even acknowledging the idea that the Imperium might not be all that it seemed, had kept them silent. But Silas could see the small cracks in their walls. The fear was still there, yes, but so too was something else, something that had been buried beneath years of indoctrination: curiosity. Then one day the first response came. It was a simple line of text, scribbled on a piece of parchment, slipped under Silas's door. The truth is buried, but it lives. It was a simple message, and yet it meant more to Silas than anything he had heard in years. He had planted the idea, and now it was taking root. It wasn't just his thoughts anymore. It was a collective, quiet rebellion, a rebellion of the mind and soul. From that point on, the responses came more frequently. They weren't always direct, and they weren't always written down in words. Sometimes it was a look, a subtle nod, or a brief exchange of glances. And sometimes, in the dead of night, a piece of paper would appear with more words, more questions, more defiance. They had begun to talk in the only way they could, and Silas was no longer alone in his resistance. Each small act of defiance was a silent rebellion in itself. The prisoners, once resigned to their fate, were now whispering, sharing the truth they had long been taught to ignore. They were realizing that they had more power than they had been led to believe. The walls of their prison, though still impenetrable, were no longer as oppressive. There was something that couldn't be taken from them: the truth and the will to speak it. Silas knew that what was growing in the fortress was still far from anything resembling a revolution. It was not even a movement, not in the traditional sense. It was a quiet uprising, one born of words, of shared understanding. But in that silence, in those moments of secret exchange, something was shifting. The Imperium, for all its power and control, could not erase the truth from the minds of those who had seen it. It could silence Silas's voice, but it could not silence the voices of those who had come to see the world as it truly was. One evening, as Silas sat on his cot, his mind racing with the thoughts of the small rebellion that was quietly growing around him, he felt a change. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the air, a shift in the atmosphere. It was as though the entire fortress was holding its breath. He had learned to read the subtle signs of the prison's rhythms over the years, and tonight the rhythm had changed. The guards had been unusually quiet, their footsteps soft and measured as they passed by his cell. The familiar hum of the fortress's machinery seemed distant, muted. It was as if something significant was happening, something that had been set in motion far beyond his control, but that would have profound consequences on everything that followed. Silas leaned against the stone wall of his cell, his mind working through the possibilities. Was this the moment? Was the first spark of resistance finally catching fire, or was it merely a fleeting moment of hope, a false alarm that would fade away, just like the other fleeting thoughts of rebellion he had seen die over the years? Then, as if answering his unspoken question, the door to his cell creaked open. Silas's heart skipped a beat as he looked up, expecting to see one of the guards. But it was not a guard who stood in the doorway. It was one of the other prisoners, someone who had been part of the quiet rebellion that Silas had begun. The man, a former soldier who had been captured for his insubordination, stepped into the room, his face grave but determined. "It's time," the man said, his voice low but firm. "The Imperium can't ignore us forever, we're ready." Silas felt a surge of adrenaline. The words he had longed to hear, words that until now had seemed impossible, were finally spoken aloud. The small rebellion had grown, the seed had sprouted, and now it was ready to fight back. The moment had arrived. The quiet rebellion was no longer just whispers and hidden messages. It had become something real, but Silas knew the cost. What would happen when the Imperium finally took notice of what was stirring in the dark corners of its fortress? The quiet rebellion that Silas had nurtured in the darkness of his cell was no longer just a fleeting hope. It was a spark that had ignited a small fire in the heart of the fortress. The walls that had once felt so imposing, so suffocating, now seemed less impenetrable. Silas could feel the energy in the air, the tension that had built up around him, as if the entire structure was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The message had spread through the prisoners. Subtle, covert, but undeniable, and now, as the man stood in his doorway, the truth was no longer just a secret among the few. It had become a rallying cry for those who had once been forgotten. The former soldier who had come to Silas was named Andros. He was a man hardened by years of military service, but like many in the fortress, he had been discarded, swept aside for daring to question orders, for daring to speak out against the brutality he had witnessed. Andros had been one of Silas's first quiet allies, someone who had quietly shared a piece of parchment with Silas, asking the question that had begun it all: what is truth? From there, their secret bond had grown, and now, standing before Silas, Andros was the first to take the step into something more than whispered rebellion. "We've been waiting for this moment, Silas," Andros said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "The others are ready, the word has spread, they're not afraid anymore." Silas felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of disbelief and excitement. He had known that this could happen, that his defiance could spread. But to hear Andros' words made it feel real for the first time. The rebellion was no longer a figment of his imagination. It was real and it was growing. "We can't wait any longer," Andros continued, stepping further into the cell. "The Imperium has kept us silent for far too long, and now we're ready to act. There are more of us than they realize. We've been building this for months, small acts, small gestures, but we've got enough to make a real impact." Silas stood, his heart racing as he absorbed Andros' words. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The quiet resistance had transformed into something more, something that could no longer be ignored. It was no longer just about the truth, it was about action. The knowledge of the Imperium's corruption had become a weapon that could be used to bring down the very system that had oppressed them all. But Silas also knew that this moment would come with great risk. The Imperium was vast, its power seemingly limitless. The Inquisition would not tolerate defiance, and the consequences of their rebellion would be dire. Andros was right. There were more of them than the Inquisition knew, but Silas also understood the power of the machine they were fighting against. The Imperium would not go down without a fight. "You know what this means," Silas said, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "Once we take this step, there's no going back. The Imperium will come for us. The Inquisition will hunt us down, and they won't stop until we're all gone." Andros nodded, his expression unwavering. "We know, but we've already been hunted, we've already been silenced. It's time to stop running, Silas. It's time to stand." Silas looked around his small cell, the place where he had spent so many months in isolation. It had been his prison, his tomb, but now it felt different. Now it felt like the beginning of something else. His rebellion was no longer a solitary act, it was the first spark of something that could change everything. "We're ready," Andros said again, "but we need you to lead us." Silas felt a heavy weight settle over him. He had been a scribe, a servant of the Imperium for so many years. He had never imagined that he would lead a rebellion, that he would stand against the very system he had once served. But now, as he looked at Andros and the other prisoners who had silently pledged their allegiance to the truth, he realized that this was the path before him. "I'll lead you," Silas said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "But we need to be careful. We need to act with precision, with strategy. The Imperium will try to stamp us out before we even begin, but if we move carefully, if we work in the shadows, we can make them listen." Andros' eyes gleamed with a mixture of hope and urgency. "Then we move tonight." The first steps had been taken. The rebellion was no longer just a whisper in the shadows, it was a force that would no longer be silenced. But would Silas and his new allies be able to outmaneuver the Inquisition, or would the Imperium crush them before they could make a difference? The rebellion had been set into motion. Silas, once a simple archivist who had quietly accepted the atrocities of the Imperium, was now the reluctant leader of a growing resistance, and the weight of that responsibility weighed heavily on him. He had spent weeks, months, living in silence, observing and learning the system he had once been a part of. Now the time had come to act, and there was no turning back. Andros and the others had been gathering in secret, preparing in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were a small, inconspicuous group, made up of former soldiers, political prisoners, and civilians who had seen the truth behind the Imperium's lies. They were united by one common cause: to tear down the system that had enslaved them, to expose the truth that Silas had uncovered, no matter the cost. Silas knew they couldn't take on the Imperium directly. No, that would be foolish. The Imperium was a behemoth, its vast machinery designed to crush any threat before it could gain any real power. But Silas wasn't planning to bring down the Empire in one fell swoop. No, he understood the power of the truth, the power of knowledge. If they could expose the deepest secrets of the Imperium, if they could spread the word of its atrocities to those who had never seen behind the curtain, then maybe, just maybe, they could spark a fire that would burn through the Empire's lies. They would bring the Imperium down, not with brute force but with the undeniable weight of the truth. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would infiltrate the central archives, where the most damning records were stored, and make copies of the most sensitive files. These were the documents that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Imperium had been built on the bodies of the innocent. These were the records that could not be allowed to remain hidden any longer. But even with a small army of loyal rebels, Silas knew that it would be a race against time. The Inquisition had eyes everywhere, and their ability to suppress information was unmatched. Any small misstep would lead to their immediate eradication. The stakes were higher than ever. That night they made their move. Silas led the group through the shadowed halls of the fortress, avoiding the patrols, moving like ghosts in the darkness. Every step felt like a heartbeat, every breath felt like the last. But there was no room for fear, not now. There was only the task at hand. The central archives were guarded by inquisitorial agents, but they were not invincible. Silas's group was careful, stealthy, and methodical. They disabled security systems, neutralized guards in silence, and moved deeper into the heart of the fortress. Each chamber they passed contained more records, more files that Silas had once cataloged in secrecy, now more valuable than anything in the Imperium's vaults. As they reached the deepest part of the archives, Silas found himself staring at the very records he had uncovered months ago, the ones that had revealed the full extent of the Imperium's cruelty. These were the files that proved that entire worlds had been erased for political convenience, that entire populations had been sacrificed for the sake of control. This was the truth he had lived with, the truth that had torn him apart. And now it was time to share it with the galaxy. Silas's hands shook as he began copying the data, transferring it to portable drives. He had never felt the weight of his actions more than in this moment. He knew that once this information was out there, once the truth was known, there would be no going back. The Imperium would stop at nothing to silence him and his rebels, to destroy the evidence. But even in the face of that, Silas pressed on. The truth had to come out. It was the only chance humanity had for a future that wasn't built on the bones of the innocent. But as they were about to finish, the alarm sounded. Silas's heart sank. The Inquisition had found them. The escape route they had planned was no longer safe. They had been compromised. "Go," Silas shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get the files out of here. I'll hold them off." Andros, his face filled with determination and fear, nodded. "We're not leaving you behind, Silas." But Silas shook his head. "This is my fight. I've already made my peace. You need to get the truth out there. It's the only thing that matters now." With a final, lingering look, Andros and the others turned and fled, disappearing into the dark corridors. Silas remained behind, his heart racing, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had given everything to this moment, and now he would do whatever it took to ensure that the truth would live on, even if it meant his own destruction. The Inquisitors were closing in. Silas heard the sound of their boots echoing down the hallway, growing louder with every passing second. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the last of the data drives and set off in the opposite direction, hoping to lead the Inquisitors away from the others. His body ached, his legs were heavy with exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The truth was out there, and he was the last line of defense. As the Inquisitors reached him, Silas turned to face them, a final defiant look in his eyes. He had done his part, he had given everything he could to expose the Imperium's lies. Now it was up to the galaxy to decide what came next. "Do it," Silas said, his voice steady, even in the face of his impending death. "End it?" The Inquisitors hesitated for a moment, then raised their weapons. The last thing Silas heard before the world went dark was the sound of their rifles charging. But even in his final moments, Silas did not regret his choice. He had stood for the truth, and that was enough. Silas's sacrifice did not go unnoticed. The data he had sent out spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The truth had been exposed, and the rebellion had begun. The Imperium, built on the suffering of the innocent, would soon face the consequences of its own actions. The machine that had crushed so many had been forced to confront the truth it had hidden for centuries. Though Silas had given his life, his rebellion did not end with his death. His story became a beacon for the oppressed, a call to arms for those who had long been silenced. The truth that Silas had fought so hard to reveal spread across the Imperium like wildfire. What had once been hidden in the shadows was now in the light for all to see. And as the galaxy turned toward this new era of rebellion, the shadow of the Imperium's tyranny began to wane. Though Silas was gone, his sacrifice had planted the seeds of a movement that would grow beyond anything the Imperium could suppress. The truth would not be silenced. And with each passing day, more and more voices joined in the fight for freedom. The Imperium's reign of terror was coming to an end, and a new dawn for humanity had begun.